perfect organism. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility. I admire its purity. A survivor. Unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality. Last word. I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
Alien Isolation is the game that brought the video game series back to the true survival horror of the first film. It's an invitation back to Ridley Scott's haunted house in space. Of course, a house on Earth would be fairly easy to exit, but a lone spacecraft floating through the infinite vacuum of space will prove a lot more difficult, maybe even impossible to escape. With nowhere else to go, a place that those on board once called their home becomes a death trap. Through the developers' loving attention to authenticity and the addition of features specific to the video game medium, we are thrown into the predatory chaos of the Sevastopol space station, an impressively believable part of the alien universe. The Xenomorph lurking in the vents isn't the only horror you'll experience either. The suffocating atmosphere of Alien Isolation comes from this idea of a haunted house. The fact that Sevastopol was once a home for many. Familiar, friendly corridors are now violated by the presence of the Xenomorph and the rogue working Joes. Even residents of the station have turned against each other in hope for a better chance at survival. Comfort turns to anxiety and fear. The infection of the Xenomorph has ripped away that feeling of security from the inhabitants of the station. There's absolute chaos, but at the same time, the Sevastopol floats silently in space. The larger spaces on the station provide relief from the claustrophobic nature of the corridors and vents, but simultaneously leave you vulnerable to attack from all angles, not just front and behind, therefore giving you more room to breathe, yet not letting you completely drop your guard and your stealth. The use of predominantly white interiors gives us a sense of sterility, and makes the infection that is the Xenomorph more prominent. This biological, heavily detailed, drooling creature crawling through the once simplistic and untainted corridors of the space station is the kind of contrast that renders this beast as a kind of stain, growing larger and larger until it consumes its surroundings entirely. Residential aspects of the Sevastopol are highlighted through the photos and memorabilia decorating its rooms. It's the impression of it being lived in which shows us the demise of the inhabitants, and leaving the player with a sense of curiosity as to where they are now. With almost complete certainty, things did not end well for them. A hostile human may speak aloud and say things like,
"Wonder what the kids are doing right now."
And the lockers you hide in often contain family photos or personal notes. Even if you don't come across these individuals or know much about them, you know that they were once here. The Sevastopol isn't necessarily an abandoned space. It's instead been turned into a mass grave, where human life is lost but their bodies remain. While lighting, or rather the lack of it, is heavily used as a generic tool in horror games, Alien Isolation does not depend on it. Even in the brightest rooms, you still feel the tension of the alien hunting you down, or the threat of other enemies spotting you. These elements of fear aren't obscured by the dark. They are hidden from view by the environment, like a corner or a wall. There will be areas of flashing and coloured lights, red lights in particular causing a greater sense of urgency, which is often paired with blaring alarm sounds. And if you've played Alien Isolation, you'll know that silence is key. The use of sound is what I would say is the game's greatest tool for instilling fear into the player. It utilises hearing things but not seeing them, which then causes your imagination to convince you of something much more terrifying. Besides, playing with the fear of the unknown is a safe bet for horror techniques. The motion sensor is the most powerful piece of equipment when it comes to making your way through the Sevastopol, giving you a huge advantage in stealth. However, in some ways, knowing the location of something that is stalking you but not actually being able to see it is a lot scarier than having it right in front of you. When I could visualize the enemies my motion tracker picked up, it gave me a kind of reassurance. I could now confirm exactly which way they were facing and see them from a further distance, both of which are information the sensor isn't able to communicate. To successfully evade the Xenomorph, you'll need to listen out for it. It makes distinct sounds as it crawls through or drops down from the vents, and things like its heavy footsteps resonate when it walks around rooms. However, just as we can use our hearing to locate enemies, they too will be able to find you if you make too much noise, and was the reason I spent pretty much the whole game crawling around and avoiding firing weapons unless in sections devoid of the Xenomorph. You're constantly thinking about the alien despite not having it present on screen, and this is what makes it an extremely effective tool of horror. We can also use this to our advantage with devices like noisemakers. Not only can you use them to draw your enemy's attention towards the opposite direction you need to go in, but you can throw them into an area of hostile people, and just let the Xenomorph go wild. It's this fairness of the sound mechanics that stops Alien Isolation from being frustrating, because if you didn't have the right equipment to evade something that will instantly kill you if it catches you, and you kept dying over and over and over again, it's not really frightening anymore, it's just annoying. A good horror game will keep you wavering on that fine line between safety and danger. In terms of sound design, the beeping of the save phones will give you that feeling of relief, yet the beeps of the motion sensor will give you a great sense of anxiety and tension. Save rooms and save points have always provided a sense of safety in games, so much so that the music and sound design of said places have reflected that feeling. Alien Isolation takes this a step further by using the beeping sound of the save point telephones to help signal its location to the player. Hearing those beeps was the most reassuring thing during my playthrough, and even then you still had to ensure you were out of sight of enemies before attempting to save. The main selling point of Alien Isolation for me was its faithfulness to the original film, more specifically its retro-futuristic, lo-fi sci-fi aesthetic, the 70s view of the future. The technology in this fictional universe is all very mechanical and dated to us today, yet from the perspective of the audience of the original film in 1979, this would have been their idea of what the future would be like. They couldn't even imagine the devices we have today would have been available only 30 years later. While not too different in their function, their aesthetic and level of technology is drastically different. The mechanical aspect of it even affects the controls in Alien Isolation. You'll often find yourself having to manually hold buttons and push the analog sticks in a certain direction, rather than just pressing X. This gives it another layer of legitimacy, and the slower actions give you more stress when you're in a rush to escape from an enemy. Retrofuturism isn't just an aesthetic choice, it's this idea of naivety of the future that makes Alien Isolation so unnerving. It reinforces that these humans are dangerously unprepared for the biologically advanced horror that is the Xenomorph, and their kitsch technology cannot save them. I think being the audience for the game, with our smartphones and tablets and touchscreens, adds another layer to the experience. We're no longer an audience looking into the future, we're an audience looking into the past's imagination of ours. With it comes a sense of nostalgia that the original audience never would have had. The original film was created envisioning a future that we, in the future, consider to be ancient. The technology and designs that the past thought was so impossible and futuristic look like relics to us. Take the motion sensor for example. It looks old, breakable, and unreliable, like someone taped together some random junk parts. Especially unsettling for us since this is our main tool for survival. The basic terminal interfaces are again so ridiculously behind, with incredibly basic functions and security. You can practically hack everything with simple timing puzzles. It's almost like it was made to look extremely functional, but what's funny is that it isn't really. All those buttons look complicated and mechanical, but their simplicity is laughable. No wonder this station has been wiped out by the Xenomorphs, and of course with a little intervention from Weyland-Yutani and the Working Joes. Their technological prowess is a farce. The technology is so ill-equipped for the predicament that the Sevastopol currently faces. The voice announcements assuring that everything is under control, and the formal and limited speech of the Working Joes juxtaposes the actual nature of the situation, leaving you with another layer of helplessness. The technology everyone once depended on is no longer dependable. If anything, it's now working against you. The simplicity of the tech is mostly down to Seegson, the company who originally owned the Sevastopol and the Working Joes. Through dialogue and text logs, we find out that they are clearly far behind in the tech race against the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. The contrast between the Working Joes and Samuels is more than enough to highlight this, and it just makes me think of them as Seegson's bootleg androids. We are playing this graphically advanced video game, a form that the Alien universe's technological naivety almost forbids from existing in that world. Video games from the 70s are extremely primitive in comparison to the graphical prowess of Isolation. In a way, the form we are experiencing this world in is more futuristic than any of the daily technology on the Sevastopol, with the exception of androids and spacecraft, things that require far more knowledge to advance than the computers and mechanisms of the station in terms of our reality. The world in Alien Isolation is stuck between being futuristic and primitive from our perspective, plus a lot of the futuristic elements of it are made to appear gritty and worn out, which actually in a way makes things more honest and believable. This believable future, however, is now lost. It's a future that has not yet happened, but we now know that it never will happen. The likelihood of it existing diminished between 1979 and the present, slowly but surely. It's a timeless era that we have only experienced in film, a ghost of history that never truly happened, and that we, the player, are lost in also. Unlike Weyland-Yutani's models, the androids that Seegson produce are a lot less advanced. These working Joes have very limited speech, but most importantly, look cheaply manufactured, adding an air of creepiness solely based on their appearance, which was conceived from that of 1970s resuscitation dummies. Dummies, dolls and mannequins are, for a lot of people, a little unsettling to look at. Obviously, the uncanny is what makes it so eerie, but their purpose adds another layer. They mimic humans, but in situations of danger, and in this case help ensure improved safety of real humans by teaching them CPR. Unlike an actual person in need of CPR, these dummies were never living. Their cold, fixed expressions already show a lack of life. In fact, there is a notable resuscitation dummy called Rasusi Ann, an incredibly popular CPR doll modelled on the likeness of a victim of drowning, or more specifically modelled on a mask of her face. The face of these dummies is basically a death mask, and considering the very typical appearance of the working Joes, they too wear this death mask, even if it's indirectly. Their technology makes them highly unreliable, and the fact that their centralised AI has been compromised to cause them to be hostile doesn't help. As I've mentioned, their unvaried speech ends up being incredibly out of touch with the situation on the Sevastopol. They continue spouting formal messages, and are incapable of communicating anything of actual use. This formality starkly contrasts their murderous capabilities, but also exhibits a programmed delusion that everything is fine. The Working Joe advertisements stress the fact that you always know a Working Joe. There is no mistaking an android for an actual human being, something which seems to be an issue for people in regards to the Weyland-Yutani models, or could just be a desperate marketing attempt considering their sales aren't that good at all. Despite this, there are still attempts for it to look humanoid, like its appearance is stuck halfway between machine and man with its folds of rubbery skin, something which is arguably more disturbing than just having a realistic android like Samuel's. There are no facial movements, and its eyes glow white, or orange if they're agitated, and even though it has its own blood, it's an unnatural white colour. Their artificiality is always present. What's ironic is that knowing a Working Joe didn't really help mitigate the danger of them. What was supposedly designed to quell people's fears of suspicious androids ended up being more fearful than anyone could have imagined.
We're not playing God. Some say God created man in his own image, but here at Seegson, we know where our boundaries lie. Our Working Joe synthetics are instantly recognizable and distinguishable from the real thing, and are programmed to act that way.
Of course, this video wouldn't be complete without covering the star of the show, the Xenomorph. And to understand it a little more, we need to take a look back at the production of the original movie. It's important to mention that two different people worked on the human and the alien elements of the film. Ron Cobb was the concept artist on the human designs, whereas H.R. Giger worked on the Xenomorph and the derelict spaceship on LV-426. Ron Cobb's work was ultra-modern and clean, with shiny floors and basic colours, whereas Giger's work was a stark contrast to this. His artwork in general was dark, industrial and sexual, like something from a nightmare. He would blend human, animal and machine to create biomechanical works of terror and elegance. They were mostly monochromatic and cold, just like the relentless predatory instincts of the Xenomorph. And the fact that there were two different minds working on two different worlds is what makes the alien life form even more unwelcome on the human spacecraft. The life cycle of the Xenomorph has a lot of sexual connotations, starting with the impregnation of an unwilling host, who is ultimately killed once the parasite has grown enough to leave the body. People are victims of this unforgiving life cycle, not just through death, but through total violation of the body also. The Xenomorph takes over the appearance of its host species, hence its humanoid features. The appearance and the way the alien moves around is captivating and almost beautiful, yet its graceful movements are still somehow paired with the disgusting, murderous nature of the creature. Even the spaceship on LV-426 has a similar design to the Xenomorph, almost reflecting a belly of the beast where the events of the game all started. And it's a mighty fine piece of fan service, which I actually really liked. The Xenomorph in the game will adapt its behaviour depending on your playstyle. For example, it will be more resilient to flames if you use your flamethrower often. But just as the alien adapts, so do you. After getting caught by it from a ceiling vent once or twice, it's instilled in your brain to avoid them, always on the lookout for the ones with drool leaking out of it. The Battle of Alien Isolation was making your way to the next checkpoint, with save telephones scattered around the map in fixed locations. The risk of losing progress was ultimately nerve-wracking. From the slow introduction of the Xenomorph to sections filled with aggressive androids, the game's main threat keeps shifting, which then ends with the chaotic climax of multiple Xenomorphs and the Sevastopol ripping itself apart. Through all the horrors you experience on the station, there is one thing that keeps the narrative interesting, and that's hope. A hope for answers, a hope for the end of the Xenomorphs, but ultimately a hope for survival. And remember, in space, no one can hear you scream.